Mm. So all this started when I realized my grandfather would have been 99 the year my daughter was born. They almost share an odd century, but not really. He was born 10 years into it. She came 9 years after its not yet apocalyptic end. I float precisely 2/3 of the way between them. My family's reproductive rhythm seems to be calibrated in precise 33-year cycles, like a brood of undiscovered cicadas. Poised on opposite shores of that oceanic expanse we call the 20th century, they will never see each other's faces. But mirror images they are, all the same. My grandfather was born during what historians call the Second Industrial Revolution, a period of rapid change in chemistry, transportation, energy, agriculture, from the end of the American Civil War until the middle of the 20th century. My grandfather loved electricity. His passion for the intricacies of energy, generating it, transmitting it, using it, may have exceeded all other passions in his life. He specialized in transmission, the art of moving enormous quantities of energy from the out of sight, out of mind places where it's extracted and generated to the urban centers where it's consumed. He started working for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power in the testing labs and worked his way up. The spider vein network of lines he designed, planned, and administered fueled the 20th century's imperial mode of living. Radios in the 20s and 30s, TVs in the 40s and 50s, air conditioners in the 50s and 60s, jacuzzi tubs and heated pools in the 70s. By the time he became the department's general manager in 1968, the utility had to remind its sticker-shocked customers, hey, it's not just a light bill anymore. Like long-distance water, long-distance power insulated human senses from the extremities of desert life. Los Angeles jumped coastal mountains and flooded into the hot inland valleys where I grew up. Between my grandfather's birth and my daughter's, Los Angeles grew 12-fold. Between my grandfather's birth and my daughter's, the earth got hotter by 1 degree. It's not just a light bill anymore. Now, I want to welcome you here. Thank you for coming and be willing to be present with me and one another for the next 75 or 80 minutes. So to truly arrive in this space, please close your eyes, put your feet flat on the floor. Feel the earth supporting your body. Breathe in. Breathe out. Allow your spine to grow as if your head is being pulled by an unseen cable toward the sky. Breathe in. Breathe out. Feel the energy in your body inflating your lungs without you even being aware of it. Breathe in. Breathe out. And when you're ready, ask yourself, when do you notice electricity? When do you feel it, hear it, smell it? Do you feel it coursing through your body? And is it a pulsing or a warmth? Do you see it in the wild, whipping through the sky in light, bright bolts? Or feel its buzzing in the walls of your bedroom? Do you take it for granted, forgetting all it's done, the way it helps you build body and mind? Do you notice it most when it's gone?
Lumoweld, guy and messenger strand, a long time between poles. I suppose they made
Wire.
Wire, yeah.
For the poles.
I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you.
I can't believe we have to go there every single week. I mean, it's just so boring. Everybody sits there, nobody says a word. It's like we're waiting for something to happen. Like we're waiting for him to die, I guess. I mean, it's sad. It's really sad. He was this great man, and now he just sits there smelling like pee. It's gotten a little bit better since he had that surgery that took the water off his brain, but now sometimes he actually wants to talk. I'm not sure what's worse, like today. I think somebody must have told him that I wanted to be an artist, so he decided to connect with me. He took out this box of photographs that he'd taken. I didn't know he was into them. He showed me them one after another. And do you know what they were? Every single photo was a picture of a transmission tower. He said they were just so beautiful. And he gave them to me. He wanted me to have them. So now I have this box of photos of transmission towers. What am I going to do with that? A few years later, he was gone. I sat on the other side of the continent in an art history class, partly paid for by the money he had left. In a lecture on Caspar David Friedrich, I thought of my grandfather. His experience of those transmission towers was a variant of the sublime, directed not at nature, which had somehow been stripped of its power to awe, but a feat of human engineering. For him, there was nothing mundane about electricity. It promised radical change in the experience of work, recreation, and home, the organization of life itself. Transforming night into day at the flip of a switch, electricity made once dark hours newly productive. Cities stopped going to sleep. Electricity annihilated time just as time had annihilated space. In this way, it made us modern. Los Angeles began to electrify in 1882, when it was still little more than a town. By the time my grandfather arrived in the city, downtown streetlights were a half-century old. But a wave of people and products demanded more power, and in 1928, Congress authorized a hydroelectric dam on the Colorado. The river's water and power would be distributed unevenly across a booming Southwest until there was very little river left at all. It took 3 years to design it and another 5 to connect the turbines in Nevada with the neighborhoods of Los Angeles. 1 million people crowded the streets that night to witness the arrival of the river's first power and to take in a light show that would have dazzled their parents decades before. He must have been there that night. He never struck me as much of a dancer, but maybe he got caught up in the excitement of the crowd. Maybe he found himself, if not quite dancing, then carried by 1 million other dancing feet through the midnight bright streets of the city he would help build.
Astride the power of 115,000 horses with burning plumes outspread, the giant of Hoover Dam, Electricity, rode into Los Angeles last night, casting a heretofore unseen and magnificent glare on more than 1 million persons who crowded into the downtown district from end to end. Across the desert he came, 266 miles over the mountains and down the Pomona Valley, bringing the first great fruits of the impounded Colorado River, light and power. And he wrought his miracle. The dim-lit city, starting up like an aroused sleeper at his touch, was in an instant clothed with such flaming radiance as has never been seen before. Throaty and thrilling, the massed thousands lifted their voices in wonder and applause. The giant had arrived. He surged down in a river of light and heat and stood in their midst with meteor eyes flashing and lightning blazing about his head. He was summoned at the beckon of a young woman's finger.
We are about to witness the realization of a long-cherished ambition. The arrival, through the world's greatest electrical system, of the first impulse of energy created by the power giants at Hoover Dam. Through these material structures, the forces of nature will render continuing service. These structures will order our social and natural worlds. 100 years hence, we might speak of infrastructure as that cyborg being whose making, working, disciplining, performance, gender formation, and hybridity will become, operationally, the experience of culture itself. We might speak of infrastructures of feeling, out of the knowledge that matter, technology, and space form the tangible, material conditions in which our social emotions are developed, felt, and communicated. We might become so intimate with infrastructure that we are unaware of its operation. For our children and grandchildren, infrastructure might become that invisible, living mediation of what organizes life, the life world of structure. Conscious of the honor here bestowed upon me, I now press this key signaling the beginning of a new era of progress and forgetting for the great Southwest. Tonight, I invite you to feel and think with infrastructure. Tonight is about conflicting visions of the future, uncertain filiations, and different ways of assembling the past. Tonight is about reconciling with where you come from. It's also about critique. Critique as an act of love. Tonight, I want to queer the environmental history of my family, even at the moment of its first fragmentary writing. By queer, I mean to change our orientation, the place from which we begin, the objects we use to situate our bodies in space, the direction we allow our desires to tug. My grandfather gestated transmission towers, brought forth miles of cable, and nursed power plants into being. Like all parents, he had no idea what he had birthed or who he was leaving behind. He made the desert buzz. In this queer infrastructural genealogy, I am kin not just with my human cousins or even other creatures, but also with the Victorville switching station, the Silmar converter station, the Pacific DC intertie, and the Hoover Dam. In this ancestral geography, I locate myself not just between mountains and oceans, but by dams, coal mines, reactors. In this spiraling timeline, I feel my way down another branch of my familiar family tree, something other than a linear progression of generational begats, a settler straight time that leads to my child, and a 421 parts per million world. My tools in assembling these relations are clumsy. My research skills, imprecise. It's a performance of poor theory that moves through appropriations and improvisations, through descriptions that do not leave what is described unchanged.
Yade, Shishid Nanjle, Bilagana Bashichin, Kiani Dashiche, Bilagana Dashinale, Ado, Diligin de Inasha.
My name is Percy Deal.
My name is Nicole Horseherder.
So we're with Dene Care, Dene Citizens Against Ruining Our Environment. It's a long-time Navajo environmental justice organization.
I'm 73 years old.
I am Dene. I was born and raised on Black Mesa, and I still live there today.
My mom and dad and my grandma and my grandpa, and going back into history.
The founding members were Navajo individuals who came from different parts of the reservation.
I am the director of Twanajona Ane, which is translated to Sacred Water Speaks. It's an organization that's also based on Black Mesa.
This is the only home that we have on Black Mesa in Big Mountain. We have not lived any other place, and we did not come from anywhere else.
Our reservation is very remote. In the 70s, if you don't live in Black Mesa, people did not know about it. Only the ones that were actually living in communities knew about it.
There are pastoral people, there are farming people, there are people who still gather wild herbs and tobaccos and other medicines.
That's how I got involved. There was no choice. I have to stand by the teaching of my parents and my grandparents that we are only here to protect the land.
We don't want to go elsewhere like people do. If they have a home where it's getting trashed, they could move away. We don't have that luxury. We cannot.
They saw our culture and our way of life being in the way of what they call progress, economic development. But we saw it the other way around.
Ed Kanouse was born in a bungalow in Amarillo, Texas, the only child of a railroad worker and an ambitious church secretary convinced that her son could go far. She encouraged an early aptitude for science and engineering. She recalled erector sets of great complexity and his love of crossing wires to watch the sparks. "It's just so beautiful," he'd tell her. When the Depression hit in 1929, he was already a student at the University of Oklahoma. By 1932, he'd moved to California, not as a Dust Bowl refugee, but as a Caltech grad student, trailed by thousands fleeing ecological collapse and poverty back home. His mother wrote daily, continuing to supervise his education as she had since grade school. She encouraged him to find a taste for the finer things and coached him in the arts of professional diplomacy, outperforming his entry-level job at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, earned him one promotion, then another, and then a scholarship to Stanford. For the rest of his career, his colleagues called him Doc.
There are not a lot of photos of these years, but I like to imagine him anyway. Before the top floor office, the brooding, and the pipe smoke, whose musky sweetness still evokes his memory. I remember wanting to embrace that smell. I do not remember an embrace. So instead, I place him in the flickering newsreel footage I've seen. A young man working the Mojave under transmission towers, maybe sleeping in canvas tents at night. The Hoover Dam had just been completed, but the lines were losing power as they passed through the desert. It was costing the company money. He'd go out there with these custom-built instruments to figure out whatever might be behind that loss of power. Background radiation, variations in the Earth's electromagnetic field, or the shifting ionization of the air by temperature, humidity, by wind, or by the power lines themselves. In his dissertation, he thanked his boss at the DWP, the scholarship that funded his study, and his advisor. Not the female stenos who typed up his findings, not his wife who tolerated years of lengthy separations, or his mother who worried about his weight and his sleep, who bought him a car to handle the commute between Los Angeles, Palo Alto, and the desert, who sent him small sums of money more times than I can count, who begged him not to drop out. At some point, working on this project, I realized that my grandfather was actually a very small man. In his top floor office, in his executive chair, his feet couldn't quite touch the floor. My grandmother, Betty, is part of this story too. Her family's presence on this continent go back far enough that people, which they only ever meant other white people, were supposed to be impressed. My grandmother's grandparents came to Southern California in the 1880s and became merchants, progressives, educators, socialists. The kind of people like me like finding on our family tree, as if we had anything to do with it, as if it makes up for everything else. When times were tough, they sent their daughters to college instead of their sons. My great-grandmother attended UC Berkeley. Grandma Betty graduated from USC. She was spunky enough to take a job that required a driver's license without ever having sat behind the wheel of a car. She learned to drive in a weekend. By the time I knew her, this spark had long since turned to ash. When she married my grandfather in 1938, his religion, very white, moderately evangelical, became hers. She submitted to her husband as head of the family. Her new faith was fervent and lifelong. Over time, his affections gave way to constant criticism. He'd pick her apart to her face, only to shower praise in earshot on his secretary. At some point, she thought of leaving him, but did not. When I was young, it was she I loved with intensity, and he with a measured sense of duty. This is my grandmother. In 1952, she's on a Southern California beach. It looks like afternoon. She seems to have no plans to swim. She's 39, younger than I am now. Her two sons, my father, 9, and my uncle, 5, play just beyond the frame. Also beyond the frame, the H-bomb, whose detonation would soon vaporize an island and generate a fireball 3 miles wide. The satellites that now measure dwindling ice caps were first launched to look for incoming missiles. They do double duty today. On a Southern California beach, on a 1952 afternoon, my grandfather snapped this photo containing all the compromises and disappointments of matrimonial love. In photographs taken by others, he often stands alone. He looks at the camera, or just beyond, arms at his side, stolid. In groups, he remains a bit offset. With close family, he manages a proprietary embrace. As they grow, his children pull away from his arm. As he ages, my grandmother steadies his hand by placing it on her own shoulder. I've looked at hundreds of these photos, made over 9 decades, stored in envelopes, boxes, and hard drives, existing as prints, slides, negatives, and digital files. There are 2 primary types of images, the fuzzy, off-kilter family snapshot, and another whose focus and composition suggest a level of professional control. The subjects are always white, overwhelmingly male, usually older. Women, if present, listen in rapt silence or are purely decorative, like the corsages pinned to their chests. Children do not figure at all. These images capture the highlights of my grandfather's career: groundbreakings, board meetings, ribbon cuttings, gala dinners. He proved very, very good at solving the big problems, as defined by the white men in these photographs, by breaking them apart into a series of solvable puzzles, then connecting one solution to another until an entire system emerged. The system met the scale of the problem, but stripped out all complexity, disavowed all connection except for the straight line linking point A and point B. In this family archive, I have found just one photo containing only my grandfather and me in the frame. It's his birthday. I am not yet 3 years old. I'm bringing him a gift. He is not looking at me. Look, I don't mean this as an elegy, but it's not really a call to action either. It's more of a call to belief. If I actually believed what I know to be true, why am I standing up here talking to you? Why are you sitting out there politely listening to me? Why am I not, I don't know, taking a hammer to a painting or blowing up any one of the 10 fossil fuel pipelines currently under construction in the United States? I love making a clever sign for every big climate march, but in daily life I dither through some way of ordering the world that may be dying but is not yet dead. It still makes claims on my time and attention that are not so easy to give up. It is, after all, the world I was born in, the world my grandfather helped make, and the one we made sense in. A world he thought was stable, predictable, that could unfold neatly along a steady curve of growth. Always growth. It's a world that strips people and land of life, that makes nature into resources, organisms compressed into coal, the force and volume of a river, the tears of a crying child, a woman's household labor, the energy that binds together all matter, all sequenced and ordered as if by the switching stations that govern connections and disconnections in the grid.
This is a city of famous sights and famous sounds. A city of beautiful places and beautiful people. A community which is preserving its past and defining its future. From classy to eclectic,
In 1986, two men broke into my grandparents' home. The police assumed they were looking for money or jewelry and electronics to sell for drugs. Instead, they found my grandparents, terrified, dialing 911. The intruders were not armed with guns, but whatever they brought for the door was put to another use. Must have felt like the end of the world. My mother brought me to the house a few days later, after the police had swept for evidence, dusted for prints. She asked me to watch my 5-year-old sister while she tried to clean up the mess. She told us not to go into the front room, the room of the carved wooden sailors, a spinning globe, the leather-bound books behind glass, the room where my cousins would crowd around our grandmother's lap to watch the oak console color TV. Sometimes I'd sneak in, turn the volume way down, and flick the dial on and off just to watch the static flash into an image, then shrink into a ball and vanish. Poof. I didn't listen to my mother. The door ajar exerted some kind of magnetic force. It's the smell that sticks with me more than anything I saw in that stolen glance. Crusted, red-brown pools still stank of the insides of my grandparents' bodies. Their blood had soaked through the carpet, splattered the ceiling, wicked up the curtain. It smelled like the end of my world. But my grandfather survived the beating, 5 years. My grandmother, about 13. She recovered well. A distorted and watery eye was her only visible scar. He was not so lucky. He occupied this delicate zone in my emotional life, suspended between sympathy and revulsion. He moved little, spoke less, and always stank of urine and another earthier smell that I associate with those who are not yet dead but already decomposing. Even as a 10-year-old child, it never occurred to me that the attackers might be anything but Black. In the years that followed the beating, I began to take walks around my neighborhood at sundown. I liked to watch the smoggy sky blaze crimson, then fade through pink to nighttime's thick orange glow. The light show rages upon a line of identical, unseeing houses. My neighbors' picture windows frame the lives unfolding inside like a stage or a screen. I walk quickly, wanting to see what's being watched or cooked or argued about before they sense the gathering darkness and drop curtains on the scene. Christina Sharp calls anti-Black racism the weather. She writes, "Anti-Blackness is pervasive as climate. The weather necessitates changeability and improvisation. It is the atmospheric condition of time and place. It produces new ecologies."
August 9, 1938. August 5th, 1938. 5 degrees Fahrenheit, 99 degrees Fahrenheit. 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Quiet. 14% relative humidity. August 3rd, 1938. September 8th, 1938. 1:39 a.m. 96 degrees Fahrenheit. 11% relative humidity. September 8th, 1938. 1:30 p.m. Fahrenheit. 48% relative humidity. Exceptionally quiet.
Back when he worked under transmission lines in the desert, my grandfather would spend weeks logging the weather. In order to understand why more power was lost in some places than others, he chose an inland desert valley as the neutral control site for his work. The name is anything but neutral. It grabs my eye as I scroll through the yellowing pages on my screen. An act of violence like so many others, normalized through repetition. It became data entry, routine. The name appears to have begun as a term of resentment against James Hamilton, a black rancher who between 1870 and 1880 managed to develop his 160-acre farm into a property more valuable than surrounding white-owned ranches. He married an indigenous woman who gave birth to a daughter and 3 sons before dying far too young. 2 of their sons became U.S. Marshals. One was the first American law enforcement officer killed in the line of duty in Riverside County. But for all this striving and sacrifice, James Hamilton would never own title to land. California and federal law excluded African Americans from the Homestead Act, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo required the U.S. government to enforce Spanish land grant claims. In 1881, Hamilton lost his land to the widow of a San Francisco lawyer who had bought the historic Rancho Pauba. He moved with his children to the Cahuilla Reservation and continued to raise cattle until he died. In 1940, the northern half of his valley was flooded to become the classy-sounding Vail Lake, named for the White family who eventually absorbed Hamilton's land into one of California's largest cattle operations. Rather than materially repair this or other acts of racial plunder, in 1970, the U.S. Geological Survey set about to remove offensive place names from the national map. They settled on the romantic-sounding Butterfield Valley in honor of a stagecoach route. In eliminating the racial slur, the memory of James Hamilton was all but wiped off the map, which with it, Black participation in frontier life and the racial animosities and solidarities it encountered. Today, if you have cash or can access the credit, you can make offers on Zillow for multi-acre home sites in Butterfield Lake Estates. They're smooth pads visible on Google Earth.
August 5,
September 11, 5:45 a.m. 72
99 degrees Fahrenheit,
53%
relative humidity.
September 16th, 11:45
August 9th, 1:45 p.m., 99 degrees Fahrenheit, 11% relative humidity.
11% relative humidity.
December 30th, 11:30.
The longest drought in a generation.
January 4th, 11:35 p.m., 71%.
The longest drought in 100 years.
The longest drought in a generation. The longest drought in 1,200 years. The longest drought.
The longest drought.
I grew up ignoring the weather. Though I should know better, after decades away from Southern California, I still usually leave home without checking the forecast. LA was like that. It let some of us forget. It made some of us think it would always be 75 degrees and segregated. LA is a favorite setting for disaster films. Earthquakes figure prominently, but the genre also favors cyborgs, volcanoes, zombies, tornadoes, aliens, nuclear bombs, God, plague, and criminal gangs. Seeing the landmarks of my hometown destroyed on camera might be even more popular than the ritual cinematic sacrifice of the Statue of Liberty. We cheer when the city goes the way of all flesh. But you know what really scared me as a kid? The earthquake drills. We seemed to have them every month. There'd be a special bell, and we'd dive under our desks, hands cradling the head. By middle school, they came with a pamphlet that outlined the recommended contents of your underbed survival kit and told us what to do with the bodies of pets and other loved ones who didn't survive. Wrap them in plastic and put them in a cool place like your garage. I mean, who tells that to a kid? Besides, most people don't have a garage. These tips populated my nightmares until they resolved into a kind of gallows humor. We laughed about being swallowed by the sea. The disaster films are mostly terrible, but even the better ones have some underlying similarities. There's always an inkling of what's to come, but disaster itself arrives in a single decisive moment, extended cinematically as a series of epic tableaux. Moral lines are cleanly drawn as naked self-interest and wrenching self-sacrifice collide. In all but the most nihilistic, there are a few people left alive to gather, mourn, and rebuild. The chosen people, usually white, the ones the audience is assumed to identify with, have their position as universally human at last secured through the ungrievable deaths of literally everyone else on earth. It's a tabula rasa, a new beginning. The possibility of rebirth rendered in Bierstadt-worthy panoramas that trade virgin forests and terra nullius for speculation on wasteland, mangled highways, collapsed bridges, smoldering ruins, crumpled dams.
If we turn to etymology, we find that the English word wasteland is a combination of waste, which comes from the Old French gast, from the Latin vastus, meaning desolate or unoccupied, and land from the Old English lan, from the Old Norse and Old Goth lan, meaning enclosure. The Old English precursor of wasteland was weston. Found principally in biblical texts, the term had religious connotations from very early on. In early versions of both the Old and the New Testaments, the weston is a place of bodily danger and hardship. Its desolation, its harsh climate, its lack of sustenance, and its menacing creatures are so inimical to human life that merely getting out of the weston alive constitutes a miracle. Furthermore, the weston tests not only the body, but also the soul. Survival in the weston is dependent on God, requiring faith and submission to divine will. Thus, in these early texts, the weston is not merely the place where redemption can occur. It is, in fact, the place through which redemption can be won. In the new translation of the Bible authorized by King James in the early 17th century, however, weston is replaced by two words, wilderness and wasteland. In this version of the Bible, the term wilderness is used to refer to wild land, land without or before human presence, while the term wasteland is used to describe land that has been ravaged or despoiled, whether by divine wrath, natural forces, or human actions such as war and pillage. But even though the wasteland constituted visible proof of divine censure, the Bible also taught that it was by transforming the wasteland into a garden that salvation was to be achieved. Thus, whereas wilderness was the place in which the lone individual might find salvation, wasteland instead became the landscape whose transformation by a community would result in redemption for all.
Well, you kind of have to talk about my father in different phases of my childhood.
Well, I remember being afraid of him. I remember being yanked out of bed and beaten with a belt because I tended to cry at night.
When I was young, he was not often present, and when he was present, he was a disciplinarian.
So I was very young, I don't know, 3 or 4. There was this Russian roulette thing going on where 5 times out of 6, Mom would come, and that one time out of 6, it would be him with his belt.
I recall really being afraid of him because if I were crying or maybe just out of sorts, and suddenly emerge in a rage and threaten to spank me or use his belt.
And I remember having nightmares, a lot of nightmares. I'd wake up and then see this thing standing, this monolith standing at the end of the bed.
And you had the feeling that there was nothing he would stop it doing in order to get you to stop whatever you were doing that he didn't like.
my grandfather would have been 99 the year my daughter was born. Instead, he died years earlier when I was still in high school. The recorded milestones of my life, my parents and his, the birthday parties, Christmases, the parade of school portraits, graduations, first relationship, first apartment, first car. These are so 20th century. I can and cannot place my daughter in these images. I have a hard time coming up with any others. An emptiness where her future is concerned is preferable to the recycled images of a Judeo-Christian sci-fi apocalypse that populate my environmental anxieties. I can't parent in a state of sublime despair, so I cultivate an absence, a productive space of blankness. It doesn't come easily to me. I realize just how much I bought into my grandfather's illusion of a stable, predictable world. When my daughter was in preschool, all wide eyes and baby fat, the grandmas at Climate Actions would choke up when they saw her. They would tell me, blinking back tears, that they marched, testified, and blockaded for her future. At those moments, I was moved and alarmed. I was moved because, quite honestly, climate change went from abstract to intimate only once I had this child. And moments of feeling shared with a stranger are rare. But the image of child as future has only ever been occupied by those who look like my white child. It's justified theft, murder, repression. That future is more about reproducing the past than remaking the world. The futures I can most easily imagine for her are the ones that resemble my own past, the ones that the entire military and techno-scientific might of the United States will go to great lengths to maintain. They're already a catastrophe for billions of others. Sustainability went from buzzword to cliche to eco-fascist fantasy without ever grappling with what exactly of this mess should be sustained, for whom, or for how long. Somewhere, a forest is on fire. Somewhere, it is always on fire. I hold my breath and sign her up for summer camp. It's easy, maybe even a little comforting, to imagine the human species going out in some singular blaze of glory. The more likely scenario is bare endurance amid chaotic, unevenly violent conditions that only occasionally cohere into an identifiable event. By more likely, I mean that's what's actually happened. The disaster isn't coming, it's already here. Did you know that the first documented instance of anthropogenic climate change may have been a drop in average global temperatures caused by the mass deaths of indigenous people in the first years following European colonization in the 16th century? By the time my ancestors arrived in what they called New England, out of some staggering lack of respect and any imagination, some 75 to 90% of the population had already died of pandemic disease. I sometimes try to imagine what it would have been like for those ancestors, the ones my grandmother was so proud of, to come upon the ruins of a village surrounded by overgrown farmland. The stray human bone may be visible in the dust of a hastily dug grave, and think, praise be, let's move in. The transatlantic trade in human beings really got going because there was no way to make this mercantile colony profitable with so few people and so much land. There were trees to cut for the Royal Navy, and elsewhere, Mayan tobacco and Andean cotton and Aztec corn to grow at plantation scale. The first insurance companies, the ones whose profits are threatened by climate collapse, got their start insuring enslavers, whether from storms or conditions on their own boats or human beings who refused to be property and threw themselves into the sea. The world that now exists, the world I so fear losing, the world my ancestors bequeathed my daughter, the one where she can appear innocent, is someone else's apocalypse, already suffered, already survived. Gentlemen, forecasting our energy needs some 3 decades into the future is a crystal ball type operation at best, but it is indeed a challenge that must be pursued. Historically, energy use in the United States has doubled, or more than doubled, every 10 years. In areas such as Southern California, we have witnessed this doubling in as short a period as every 6 to 8 years. The next slide shows the history of load growth in the area, along with our estimates of our total requirements to the year 2000. Currently, we have utilized our hydroelectric capability in Southern California and on the Colorado. The next major block of energy will be that which we've been developing the past 10 years, namely our fossil fuel sources. The western United States is rapidly moving to coal as a major source of energy, but it is not the simplest coal to mine, and therefore considerable ingenuity will be required to move it to market. There is, of course, the problem of smog. But regardless of these facts, we believe that upwards of 10% of the capacity increment, possibly as much as 20%, will come from new fossil fuel plants.
When I came back from college with an engineer degree, my mom told me that there was a meeting right down the road from where we live. The people were trying to communicate with the visitors from outside. These are non-Navajo visitors. They were trying to express themselves, but they were having a difficult time expressing themselves in English. And the visitor knew nothing about the Navajo language.
They came to a nation who did not speak English, who had to get all their information through an attorney, who spoke to an interpreter, who then spoke to councilmen.
There had been this sort of designation that the Four Corners area, including Black Mesa region, would be considered a national energy sacrifice zone, but it would deal with the pollution impacts in order to provide electricity for the rest of the western states.
Leadership within the Navajo Nation really supported the industry. The reason why they supported the industry was because of the revenue that the Navajo Nation government was receiving and also the jobs that were being provided.
They call it Navajo Generating Station. Just the title, you think Navajo people were benefiting. And that was not so.
In the making of NGS, in the strip mining that was then allowed in that area. So there was the removal of the Diné people and some Hopi to make way for coal mining, to make way for NGS, to then provide electricity that was exported outside the reservation.
And what do we get? We just get the pollution. I became a nurse. I worked on, Navajo pretty much. I began to see that there's a lot of young kids that were coming in with asthma. That was not seen back over 30 years ago. We didn't have asthma with kids, but nowadays it's pretty prevalent.
Peabody Energy operated at one time 2 mines on Black Mesa. They relied on the Black Mesa groundwater to support their operation.
The Black Mesa, where it has been mined and pretty much destroyed, desecrated, we consider that, that is a female, she's a female, and we have a male, the Chuska. So there's a duality of everything that's on our land. We were taught to respect, just take only as much as you need. You always give something back.
In our conversation with some of the communities, they have shared how different farming methods people used to use, where the reliance on water, the way they used to use water, isn't as dependable anymore, but those are really not only the effects of drought, but the effects of an aquifer having been so heavily depleted.
I don't know if any of the community were ever given an opportunity to talk about the issue back then. 1969 was the year that the lease for both NGS and the mine were signed.
Nobody had any idea how very few the jobs would be, how detrimental the environmental damages would be, how much water it was going to use.
We have been living under the impact of disaster for the last number of years.
And so, gentlemen, now for the big item. You will see that of the total remaining capacity requirement to the year 2000, in all probability, some 75 or 80% will come from nuclear-powered steam plants. In a water-starved Southern California, it is unrealistic to utilize a major portion of the domestic water supply for the cooling and condensing of steam in steam electric plants. For that reason, the majority of these sites will be located along the seacoast, where saltwater can be utilized as the cooling medium. The plant site, which we are now developing in Malibu's Coral Canyon, will in all probability be increased in size and will, of course, be augmented by some 30 more sites between Morro Bay and the Mexican border in order to meet these needs. Now, California should be number one in this vital new field, but I fear we are falling behind the rest of the nation. It is for public education that I'd like to enlist the support of each and every one of you here today. In our Malibu project, the department has been up against what is essentially quite a small and localized opposition, but with strength and influence far beyond what might be expected. Earthquake fears and safety concerns have been utilized by the opposition, but they really would object to any industrial intrusion. Now, I will not try to summarize the safety information concerning the project, for it is simply too voluminous. But let me assure you that nuclear plants can be built along the seacoast and can return water to the ocean such that the temperature differential in no way materially affects the fish or the fauna in the ocean bed. The problem of irradiation has, of course, been long since solved. And the fact is, we can design a reactor capable of sustaining a moderate to severe earthquake once a week for 40 years. So, gentlemen, these are our needs, and these are our facts. We believe that our second-to-none safety record, combined with the enormous usefulness of nuclear power, such that if Single pound of fissionable uranium can generate more electricity than 5,000 barrels of oil, will overcome the fears of this generation.
Only 3 commercial nuclear power plants were ever built in California. The rest were abandoned due to political pressures or regulatory changes in the wake of the 3 Mile Island disaster. Ed Kanouse was a VIP at the ribbon cutting of San Diego's San Onofre nuclear generating station, closed in 2012 due to radiation leaks and other safety violations. He just couldn't get the Malibu power plant to break ground. The Department of Water and Power filed 35 contract extensions over the course of the controversy, then quietly let the project expire. In 1976, California passed a moratorium on the construction of nuclear power plants until the issue of radioactive waste could be resolved. And in 1991, the year that Ed Kanouse passed away, the forgotten 98-acre site in Malibu began a slow slide toward the sea.
My grandfather lost the Malibu battle. I think he took it pretty hard. Every other infrastructure project he'd worked on had been successful. A bunch of entertainers and hippies defeated this one. He believed the future must be electric, and at least on that score, he was right. But the sun, the wind, the waves were all around him, and somehow splitting the atom was all he could see. He didn't care where the uranium came from, Namibia, or again, Navajo land. And he didn't stop to think about the waste. He had a heart attack and recovered, but work wasn't the same after that. His religion had always been vaguely apocalyptic, but he became obsessed with the end times. The signs may have been there, but not where he was looking. The year before my grandfather's death, the first intergovernmental panel established that human activities were warming the planet. He was too far gone to notice, but I was old enough and young enough to care. The IPCC called global warming potentially the greatest environmental challenge facing humankind, but nothing really changed. A petroleum-funded PR and lobbying machine played up scientific uncertainties about the speed and scale of the impacts while strategically shifting to the more neutral-sounding climate change. Anything to avoid suggesting an existential emergency that might require curtailing both the free and subsidized markets. The world's leading capitalist economies have spent the last 30 years accelerating the catastrophe they unleashed long ago. Droughts, fires, storms, and floods on a previously unimaginable, almost biblical scale have been given a new euphemism: extreme weather. The word makes it seem random, unpredictable, outside the norm, but it was predicted, and this culture can normalize almost anything. Remember, anti-Blackness is pervasive as climate change. Extreme weather necessitates changeability and improvisation. It is the atmospheric condition of time and place. It produces new ecologies. A few months before my grandfather's death, the tape of the Rodney King beating played over and over again on TV. He was way too far gone to notice, but I was old enough and young enough to care. Depending on who you were, the video shocked or traumatized or angered. For many, I know that it proved what was already known, which wouldn't make it hurt any less. I couldn't shake the feeling that the police that investigated my grandparents' beating weren't all that different than the ones that brutalized King. I wondered if my grandparents had tried to protect themselves like he did, pushing forward on elbows and knees, crawling a few inches before another blow sent them crashing to the ground. Any creature would try to flee. The images seemed so clear at first, but in loops, in freeze frames, in constant repetition, they got blurry and somehow deniable. Since then, I've never been sure if the circulation of images like these keeps outrage alive or makes the violent spectacle of Black subjugation somehow ordinary, like an infrastructure. I've been stuck inside for days. At some point, they've got to lift this curfew so I can go see a friend or go back to school. All I've been doing is watching TV. The day the verdicts came down, my carpool had taken off at lunch. I had to call my mom to pick me up. She was late again. As usual, I swear I was the last person let in Lot F. They'd already evacuated the campus, and the police were driving through to clear out anyone who was left. Suddenly, my mom swept in, driving that giant yellow boat of a Buick, my grandfather's old car, the one with the totally embarrassing license plates that said Kanouse. Well, we got home as fast as we could. I saw some smoke on the freeway. The Foot Locker on the corner was vandalized. But really, I've just been watching TV. The aftermath consumed my attention for the next year. Though most people I knew called those 5 days a riot, I learned for others it was an uprising. I threw myself into books and sporadic volunteer work to try to understand what had happened. I came to hate the malls, the gated communities, the convertibles. I even hated the Hollywood sign and the palm trees once I realized they were some real estate invention. I was so fixated on the real estate crimes of white people in my hometown that I all but missed that summer's Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro and the protests against the 500th anniversary of Columbus's so-called discovery. That these things had any connection was beyond my consciousness at the time. Even today, I feel it, but I struggle to put it into words. Tracing these connections across centuries and continents is difficult. There are no clear lines of descent. The year after the uprising, the artist Sheila Klein installed a collection of retired city streetlights in an East Hollywood strip mall. She called the piece Vermonica, after the intersection where it lay. Klein saw her piece as a celebration of the city's history, a giant candelabra around which a diverse urban family could gather, mourn, and rebuild. It was planned as a 12-month installation, but the piece remained on site for more than 20 years. Strip mall management paid the bill so the lights could turn on every night. 15 years later, a much more famous, much more male artist installed a much larger collection of retired city streetlights in front of the LA County Museum of Art. Chris Burden's urban light has become an icon of the city, a mecca for selfie-snapping tourists, the site of countless quinceañera, prom photos, marriage proposals, even protests. A crowd gathers each evening at dusk, exhaling an audible, collective gasp of wonder as the museum turns on all the lights. But what I want to know is, what is it about the act of turning on the lights that still makes us gather around? I try to imagine another scene. It's a secondhand memory, borrowed from 1,000 family photos. The ones that exist, and the ones still to come. I conjure an image with just my grandfather and daughter inside the frame. She is 5, she is 6, she is 17, she is 39. She walks with hundreds of others through a wasteland to bring him a gift. He turns away.
How come this is like a book. It's shaped like a book.
It is shaped like a
Yeah,
book.
and it's got old-fashioned letters like in books do.
And he weeps. Almost as much as a good parent, I want to be a good ancestor. There are not a lot of advice books for that, yet. Ancestors proliferate. Kinship lines blur. Genealogies go wobbly, elusive, inclusive, maybe even a little queer. Childless grandaunts and cousins to the nth remove offer relations of combination and constellation, entire webs of possibility located not along a distant horizon, but connected through a common, devastating route. I know I must account for what I inherited from my grandfather, not just money or things, but orientations, certain styles, aspirations, techniques, proximities, even worlds. He left me debts bigger than any inheritance and obligations I cannot disavow. But he is just one figure in a universe of kin, some chosen, some built, some born. My life has been shaped by all of them in myriad ways, but it will be defined by the kind of ancestor I become. So, what do I owe your grandchildren? What will my daughter owe for you? From opposite shores of that oceanic expanse we call the centuries, we will never see each other's faces, but we are connected all the same. Before I go, let me leave you with one more story. I visit the Navajo Generating Station in Page, Arizona. I was there on the 4th of July. By noon, the temperature is 112, and the streets closed for that morning's parade have reopened. Despite all I've read and all the pictures I've seen, I wasn't prepared for how close the plant is or how huge. At the time, the tribal council and the coal miners were throwing out all the stops to keep steam rising from those smokestacks. But LA had pledged to go green, and in 2016, they sold their stake in the Navajo Generating Station, a move that reduced by a quarter their reliance on coal. So the handwriting was on the wall, and the plant shut down at the end of 2019.
Well, seeing all those stacks, that is foreign to our landscape. We refer them as monsters. So we see them as monsters that are there just to take as much as you can and destroy what's there.
It was the giant of the West, 2,250 megawatts. That's how cities grew. That's how Las Vegas grew, and Los Angeles grew, and Phoenix grew.
There are people who feel like it provided a lot for them, and it did for some of their families, some revenue to the tribe, but at the same time, it was very divisive.
When we knew that the Navajo Generating Station was going to be shut down, some of the things that we started talking about was, what should it be replaced with? What should happen once it shuts down?
See, the transmission line is left there so that Navajo Nation can have alternative energy to provide power to customers both on and off the reservation.
And that's how the letter to the LA City Council began. Dear LA City Council, you have been a beneficiary of the Navajo Generating Station. Billions of dollars were made by LADWP at the expense of Black Mesa. We know that you have about 400 megawatts in transmission that comes off of the Navajo Generating Station. We're asking for continued partnership to structure the agreements differently and develop renewable energy projects that would put that energy on those transmission lines, those idle transmission lines, and really move forward in a better relationship than before.
They have a responsibility as having been owners for a long time. Just the heavy toll environmental destruction that had occurred, and also just our own traditional viewpoints of our connection, our relationship with the landscape and communities, and trying to still uphold those values and speak out about those values, that they still had a place, that they still needed to be considered in all this.
We're borrowing from the future generations. We're borrowing from our kids. Meditate on that. Let that sink in. Make it part of you. Make it true to you. Make this the truth for you so that you can then say, what can I do? What can I make sure I leave for the future generations?
When we think of infrastructure not as something that supports our individual lives, but as something that binds us together with others across space and time, the relationship changes. We locate ourselves not along lines of descent, but instead across lines of connection. We start to assemble new families, new worlds, out of the roots, wreckage, and ruins of this one. It's building, not just breaking, that can remake relations. The debt that cannot be repaid must be activated as a continuing connective principle of social life. Justice has been called the practice of responsible relations between generations, across spaces. And our genealogy is also electric. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for this fantastic performance. And now I would like to welcome Professor Anja Gossen for a conversation with Sarah, and after that we will open for questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Would you like a glass of water?
I've been drinking throughout. Water, that is.
So good to see you again.
Thank you so much.
The generosity of our first encounter that I'm delighted to see your work here shown and shared with us in its final form. And I know there's the last few years in themselves have been another story to tell on this project. So I've been looking forward to seeing it come together. There's so many ways one can begin to engage this fabulous piece. One can think of this as kind of the 3 words of the title, and we can begin to think of them together. But I probably will kind of start the notes where you end, which is on the question of responsibility towards the future, and kind of maybe where also the performance somehow starts and ends beyond kind of this frantic feeling of kind of the ecstasy and the agony of electricity, kind of that shivering body that kind of moves beyond binaries to begin to ask us to think of other ways of relating to this infrastructure. So to me, some kind of, it's a reading that comes across almost as a life sketch, something that is read at a moment of a person's death, usually by the deceased family. It's read during the funeral program, and the sketch usually provides significant insight into the life of the departed, written with just enough empathy and humor to prevent listeners from falling into an excessive melancholy of what is at stake. To record an ancestor's life is particularly challenging when the figure is at the thresholds of respectability, when they're assigned and enmeshed in monstrous qualities that become more pronounced in the liminal state between life and death. And this is a life sketch of electricity, a speech act for a future, one that learns to live with the inheritance of electric matters as legitimate elements of history, if only to begin to speculate on other possible afterlives. And here's where the story of responsibility lies. It's the question of one's ability to respond, how one is made to choose, not necessarily what we inherit. We're thrown into our inheritances, whether we like them or not. But the question of one's ability to respond and how one is made to choose to inhabit the legacies of broader family narratives and environmental destructions and their interrelations, to figure out what is to be done, or maybe to perform, being more appropriate for the media of tonight's event, particularly with matters that have been previously dismissed or demonized in the imagination. So there's a few moments in which the environmental anxieties come across in the narrative of your electric genealogy, in what you beautifully term between sympathy and revulsion. It's a sentiment that does a few works to us. I think it brings broader conversations of kind of a history of infrastructure that might be niched within narratives of political economy and kind of history with a big H, closer to the personal, the body, her stories. And in doing that, begins to unearth the other stories that were part of that bigger story. The story of James Hamilton, or in sequence, the story of the grandma, the story of James Hamilton and his indigenous wife, their stories of dispossession. So in telling a story, recovering other stories that were not there, and in kind of situating oneself mostly between generations, and that act of inheriting to pass down, the inevitability of that scales of transmission, as you put them. Less the stories necessarily of generation or the generator or of distinct generations, but the stories of the transmissions across them. So the kind of, I've been thinking of that agency of the act of performance, kind of that act of necessary mourning, maybe, that is necessary for assuming responsibility, kind of an enactment of historical narratives, kind of to describe what has changed, to reckon with one's sympathies and revulsions to render approachable feelings, careful, or a matter of care, what might otherwise remain kind of a history of technocratic infrastructures, and bring them home to practices of care, to ones to begin to feel with. And this kind of context of LA seems kind of quite appropriate in the way you've weaved through it narratives of frontier, embedded, situated knowledges to relate to its broader series of representations, to ultimately situate it as critique as an act of love, which beautifully comes across in the moment you're calling on us to believe in a change, a possible change of orientation, all while reckoning with the weights of worlds that have been destroyed and the difficulty to imagine otherwise. Kind of the story of the very small man is the story of the infrastructure we inhabit, and yet there's other stories that are relevant in that sense. So there's a moment where all this comes to me very strongly together in the event of 1992, kind of in that narrative. The year seems to assume a lot of the narrative power that is there. It's the racial politics that unfold in the policing of a body, the kind of global event of a planetary consciousness that is happening in Rio, all while one is reckoning with the dimensions of loss that are interweaved into one of them. So kind of that historical moment seems to be quite relevant. And I'm wondering through, they don't make sense, and I'm, operating in the fringes of my domain. I should say that this is wonderful because this event is one of the few we've had where architecture and ACT are collaborating on an event. So I'm kind of a small link in between that, but you'll see how the audience is only there to amplify. But I want to end on a small question, and I would love to hear from you on how it felt during the performance to kind of ask the viewer to bear not only the weight of a previous environmental history of destruction, but then almost a sense of, and the word is not fair, it's a bit of a push, but maybe lamentation or challenges or the emotional reckoning of the kind of privileges of settler colonialism in the land, and kind of the tensions that unfold in the end of the narrative between a possible change in that transmission direction and between the voices that we hear. And this is probably something I'm familiar with the rest of the work that you do and kind of the environmental histories that involve a bodily practice of walking through sites, who you see, whom you speak to. So I'm sure the question of who the viewer is asked to listen to is something that is there. And as we're thinking, I'm thinking of kind of figures within maybe feminist speculative fabulation. Ursula Le Guin, Donna Haraway. I don't know if Ursula would she wouldn't identify as a feminist, but kind of on both somehow inhabiting the same space of the Western continent, and both themselves reckoning with the legacies of their inheritance. Ursula Le Guin, the writer, being the daughter of an anthropology professor in Berkeley, who've kind of written on, I'm butchering the book probably, but something like The Last Indian Man who was there. And Donna Haraway, in a beautiful scene of a documentary about her reckoning with a basket from the Navajo Nation, and kind of with that unease of holding both the artifact and the story of something that she's inherited, with that inevitable question of the ability to respond. So almost the act of narration coming across with the imperative of asking, how does one respond? What are my abilities to respond in that configuration of the world? So maybe I'll just open it with those and see how that You have your
I
own
still
mic.
I still have my mic on. Yeah, thank you. That was so beautiful. And it's really such a privilege to hear such a rich sort of working through what is a tremendous amount of material to ask people to sit through and witness. So I love the voluminous notes in your spidery script, and just the attentiveness that you give to the language that was used in the performance, and your riffs on it as well. So, yeah, I approached a lot of the composition for this work actually from a place of material objects. So it was interesting that you bring up that scene with Donna Haraway in the film. So the suit, which is not my grandfather's suit, but could have been, right? This kind of speculation of a suit when I thought I was doing something about my grandfather and saying, like, I have no idea where to begin. Let me go to get a costume, and finding a suit that allowed me to speculate into his body, right? Thinking through the material inheritance of family photographs, which are themselves, right, petrochemical kind of fossil fuel objects as well. Thinking about these like as objects to think with, objects to work with, and then remembering the story of my grandfather giving me a box of photos that I didn't know what to do with for 30 years, right, which is about that period of time of a generation. So it's something about time and objects, time and material, a spiraling timeline that is worked through the performance, and then this sort of careful kind of selection of objects that are anachronistic, that are brought in adjacency with one another, so that we can sort of sit with stories that are typically rendered apart, and that are only uneasily held together in the space of the performance, and to hopefully resonate beyond that, so that we can continue to build those resonances, long after we've exited from this room. I think I also approached this project really thinking about, how a person, a subject, right, is full of other stories, that there is not a story that is my story or a story that is your story. I have a position that I can speak through and from, but is adjacent to and incorporates other narratives and other perspectives. And so to bring those present into the performance involved not just human voices, but the sounds of winds and crickets and waves and electricity itself as a kind of character or force that I wanted to make referentially present, more of this matter that mostly exists acoustically or visually, and not as objects on stage. I don't know how much that answers your beautiful...
Totally. I mean, maybe I would love you if you could speak more on that relationship between infrastructure and performance. Because I think at some point, and for the hell of me, I can't read my own handwriting, but on how images for kind of settle into specific infrastructures that foreclose the possibility of other imaginaries. And I'm wondering how the materiality of the performance allows you to work towards opening that, or how does it respond to kind of the closure of infrastructure as an imaginary.
I think over the last few years, infrastructure has obviously become part of the political conversation. Washington, D.C., the Green New Deal, all of that. And earlier, this infrastructural turn in the humanities invited us to think about the way that whatever we are doing is subtended by ideological structures that resist transformation and are a way that past materializations of ideology persist into the present and future, and therefore form the grounds on which we might act. And so attention to those processes becomes a precondition for transformation. in becoming sort of intimate or trying to collect a variety of different objects from this past, I was constantly encountering sort of infrastructural challenges of that, like, what do I do if a bulb breaks, right? How do I get my laptop to talk to this television that was manufactured 40 years before the laptop was? And so this in this very small, kind of invisible way, simply orchestrating the persistence of these technologies of image making and imagery production into the present moment is a kind of choreography of care for these technologies and infrastructures of the past.
So maybe we can open it up to questions from the audience. Yeah. Caroline, who's coordinating and made much of this happen. The first question.
I'm sorry, I can't help asking the first question. It's so compelling, this work and this process for you. I loved the very end because it felt like a redemptive arc. But because you did so much work to include the voices and the perspectives of non-white supremacist settler colonials, I was also able to see it as coyote. Mm. So your grandfather, you get to love your grandfather again because his transmission lines might carry the solar energy that benefits the Navajo, right? So this husk of a collapsed dream is reanimated and redeems something, right? So this is one sort of white perspective, but then it's coyote because they're kind of occupying the infrastructure and they didn't have to pay for it. And they're asking Los Angeles to pay for it, right? So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that ending, which helped me feel better, you know? So, I mean, partly it's a rhetorical gift to your audience, because we've been through a lot. But, you know, just maybe reflect on that decision to end that way.
Yeah. So this project was delayed by 2.5 years by COVID and ended in a completely different fashion prior to the demolition of the Navajo Generating Station and the proposal, right, as yet unrealized, right? So that's an important piece of this. I have a Google alert just waiting for the moment that Los Angeles will actually pick up this proposal that was made by Nicole Horseherder, who we hear in the film. So there is the possibility for a future, right, that is a different relationship than has existed in the past, but that possibility is as yet unrealized. So I think about, and I fully anticipated something to happen over the last 1.5 years that I've been showing this piece, and it has yet not, right? So that possibility for redemption, if redemption is even what we want, I think about it less as redemption as the possibility for a new relationship built out of the detritus of the old, is still out there, right? They're still waiting. We are all still waiting. Right.
Do I see? No, maybe.
No.
Hi, thank you so much. This was it was a lot and very engaging. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. There's like throughout this, what kind of came up for me, I kept wanting to try and read or see some kind of like apology, but then it also felt very unapologetic. And I'm curious to just hear sort of, you know, there was sort of this unapologetic confrontation with harm, right? And but just how you sort of see this piece in relationship to that idea of an apology or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm much more interested in a politics of reparation than apology. And I see the proposal, unrealized proposal, to buy this solar-generated power, right, as an act of reparation. The apology I think serves the apologizer in this case a lot more than it does the people who deserve the apology. And so I'm much more interested in affecting that and really like trying to do an unmasking of the various levels at which that harm existed. And that the harms of settler colonialism, first and foremost harm indigenous people, Black people, and other people of color, but they also redound to harm the colonizer, right? And to apologize to others is, we're sort of sitting in a toxic stew, right? And I want to grapple with that, what we actually have that connects us through these violent legacies, which is not to equate the forms of harm, but to recognize that they exist and they actually are potentially the foundation of a shared articulation beyond the harm itself.
Hi, thank you so much. That was beautiful. I found it really profound to be watching your performance and also all of the media, to think about this as a form of media, or like the medium that you're choosing to do this in. It's like, so often the large infrastructure projects, like what you showed, are sold to us through the clips of presidents talking about these being built as job creation. Mm-hmm. And so seeing you sort of illustrate this in this personal way of somebody who then had one of these jobs, and how like it's not just a job, of course. It ends up sort of living in the lineage, and sort of you even described it as like kinship, not just amongst the people who then can have a life that gets supported by that job creation, but then like kinship with the infrastructure itself, or with the electricity itself. And so I really loved that you illustrated that as well in the beginning, by having us sort of breathe while like listening to the sound of electricity, and then sort of feeling it, in the sense that like you doing this performance has the kind of electricity moving through your own blood, and then through us sort of like experiencing your performance viscerally. So yeah, so I guess that's a kind of winding and spiraling way. I liked that you also just said that you told the story in a spiraling time scale, because I've been thinking that way as well through this semester. But so, yeah, so for me this was so powerful, like specifically because of the medium of you doing this as a live performance and bringing in so many different media types, and that it happens live. So I'm curious just to kind of hear more about, like, yeah, how, of course it's deliberate, because that was so precise, but yeah, just to hear more about like your specific choice in the media as a medium that you're delivering this message through.
Yeah, thank you. It was a very reluctant choice. I tried really hard not to do a performance, but I started out thinking that I was going to make a film, and I started filming things and writing things and screening the footage with voiceover that I live at a few artist residencies, and people were really adamant that I needed to be there, which was absolutely terrifying because I had never done any performance, like since I was maybe in 8th grade in school plays, right? But I really embraced it, and I think that it's incredibly important that I don't just press play and then the lights come up and I talk to you about it, but there's a way that I'm vulnerable, that things can always go wrong, right? That I'm inviting you and sharing this space with you, like I say at the beginning. And I also think that if I am challenging or asking people to account for their relationships to what is invisible, that I should be doing that live, right? And trying to perform that which I am requesting the audience also do. You know?
Thank you. That was really incredible. I just had a question about the sublime. because it really comes through in the work, this sense of both like awe around this technology, but also unease and terror. And I just was hoping maybe to hear a little bit more about how you kind of navigated or dealt with this question of the technological sublime.
Yeah, I mean, that was very much on my mind, especially really early on in the project, realizing that my grandfather experienced that, right, in a moment where people could still see electricity and infrastructure, when there was a civic spectacle or there was a culture of celebration around what we were building. That was, like the audio clip was a little composite, but it was basically verbatim from LA Times coverage, right? This really kind of like softcore porn about electricity coming to the city. So I was very interested in channeling that, both because it's like kind of humorous, but also because there's something that I think we can actually learn from with that, right? If we could invest those infrastructures that subtend our lives with the same respect, fear, and awe, maybe we could have a more intimate, meaningful relationship with the energy transition that has to take place, right? Can we somehow, without replicating the naivete and the willful unseeing of the costs of those things, actually invest emotionally, right, in the possibility of transformation? So I think that the technological sublime has that, kind of political duality as well as a emotional duality to it, right? And I was interested in revisiting that moment in this moment and seeing where it led.
Nice note to end this evening. Thank you, Sarah, so much on behalf of the Department of Architecture and the Art Culture Technology program for sharing your work with us. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you for the audience online. We will say goodbye to you now. Rania, thank you for your reflections, and special thanks to our team, ACT and Architecture, for making this event happen.
Thank you so
We'll
much.
hope to see you
Amazing
again.
AV light